If you get to go fishing early November and then late in November, man, what worked early on, not to say that it can't work at all, but you're probably going to have to make a little bit of adjustments on it towards the end of the month. And the type of places where I'm throwing Rocco early in November, maybe the kind of places where I end up throwing Tiny at the end of November.
Crankbaits, man. I'm
Yeah.
scoping.
Gonna scope. I ain't doing no cranking. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to the Technique of the Month video for November. I think this is going on, we're getting near the end of like the third season or so, I think, of these Technique of the Month videos, and y'all seem to enjoy them, and it does get a little bit difficult trying to always come up with something that's not exactly like I talked about a year or two before, but trying to trying to work enough techniques in there and cover stuff to give you all some good information every month. But November, what I wanted to talk about this month is really a crankbait kind of breakdown. Really diving into where I'm going to use particular crankbaits during this month versus versus going forward. So which style baits work when and where, and watercolors and all that kind of stuff. Because I think in November, I think of it being a month where a lot of stuff changes out there on the water. You go from the start of November where, depending on where you're at and how many cold fronts you've had, that the water could still be in upper 60s, to the end of November that it could be already down to the low 50s, upper 40s even, So a lot changes, and a lot changes with the bass and with their attitudes and the way that they're feeding and all that kind of stuff throughout the month of November. Something that works early November is probably not going to work very well towards the end of it. So you want to be able to adapt and want to be able to change and want to be able to, to catch fish from the beginning of the month to the end of the month. So, crankbaits, again, are one of my strongest suits, I feel like, in fishing. It's something that I feel like I understand pretty well. And this time of the year, you're able, to take that and go from really shallow water out to kind of some of those mid-depth ranges and stay in tune with those fish with a crankbait. So really, we're gonna break it down by a couple different styles. So I've got 4 different baits right here that I'm looking at. I've got an OG Tiny, I've got an OG Rocco, and then I've got a DT6 and a DT8 as well. So got some baits here from real shallow with that OG Tiny, from a bait that only runs 3 or 4 feet out to a DT8 that'll run honestly 8 or 9. You can maybe get 10 foot out of that bait if you try really hard, but it'll get down there pretty good. And we've got stuff from a pretty aggressive square bill like Rocco, honestly, to that DT8 with that straight bill on it. It's a pretty subtle, pretty natural bait, and the DT6 and the OG Tiny, in my opinion, would kind of fall in between. And I tried to pick colors that would be, something that, just looking at them, would be something that I would probably be fishing with this time of the year. So we're going to start with the Rocco. Square bill, round bodied bait, a bait that is definitely more aggressive, has a wider wobble to it, definitely has the most thump of any of these out here. And it being a square bill lends itself to fishing in cover really, really well. So this is, when I'm thinking early in November, that is probably where my mind's at to start with, is with that Rocco, because I'm still thinking, so there'll hopefully be some cover left in the water, whether it's laydowns or, a lot of rocky banks, really snaggy kind of rocks and that kind of stuff, the kind of places where those fish are going to be wanting to be in some cover. That's where I'm going to be using Rocco, as well as on the warmer end of that water spectrum. Places and the type of places where I'm throwing Rocco early in November, maybe the kind of places where I end up throwing Tiny at the end of November, because those fish are, the water's cooled down a lot, the bait's moving slower, and I want a much more subtle bait, even in the same places, same watercolor, all those kind of things, where I was able to catch fish on Rocco earlier in the year. I'm going to be trying to do the same exact thing with Tiny a little bit later in the year. I think of that water being up in the 60s, 65, 60, 65 degrees, man, Rocco is the bait to go with then. That water gets down into the low 50s. Oftentimes that's when I'm going to be picking up Tiny to be throwing in those same 3 to 5 foot depth ranges. And color wise, again, you can see both of those are, pretty natural shad colors. That tuxedo shad, certainly with that black back, a little bit lends itself for a little bit dirtier water, but that natural shad and that tiny, man, I'll catch fish on that in really off-colored water as well. But so those are, for the really shallow stuff, those places where I think of those fish being up in those flats and that kind of thing, that's where I'm expecting to be fishing those baits up there. Yeah, less than 3 or 4 feet deep. That's where that's going to be happening. As it continues to cool off and you keep getting those fronts, that bite is definitely going to fade away. Those fish are going to end up pulling out of those areas. That water gets too cold, and certainly around here, a lot of our lakes are drawing down that time of the year, so the water literally just leaves those places, and those fish end up pulling out and transitioning out to a little bit steeper, a little bit deeper banks and that kind of thing, and they just end up falling down a little bit sometimes in the water column as that happens. The other part of that, down on the lower to midsection of the lakes, the water is just a lot clearer, so the fish don't live quite as shallow in some of those areas, especially when it starts cooling off like that. Those fish are going to be more into that 4 to 10 foot range, so you just need a deeper bait to get to them anyway. Even when that water is 55 or 60 degrees, the fish haven't really slowed down too much yet, but just given the watercolor of where their environment is, they're going to live a little bit deeper. Those situations, that's where I'm going to want to have the DT6 and the DT8 tied on, something that I can fish, a little bit deeper depth ranges. Great thing about both of these baits, and it literally is the same bait. It just has a different lip in it. I mean, those are the exact same body. One just has that turn down lip in it that we've known for so long with the DT6, and that DT8 has basically a miniature version of a DT10 bill in it. So just right straight out the nose. Looks very similar to a DT10 bill. But the great thing with those baits is, man, they cast so good. Heavy baits for their size really fly really well in the wind. And it doesn't matter if it's a windy day or whatever, man, you can really bomb both of those baits. You'll have some blustery days in November, and both of those baits cast just so very well. And both of these I end up picking a crawdad color in, because typically when you're getting into this time of the year, on those parts of the lake, that lower to mid section, water a little bit clearer, I like those natural crawdad patterns, especially that root beer crawl. That's something I catch a lot of fish on that time of the year. Just a green back, a little bit of bone kind of colored sides, pale orange on the belly. Man, that bait imitates those crawdads that are still out a little bit that time of the year. And I'm typically fishing that around rock as well. So when I'm in that, rocky environment, I've got a little bit of wind, fishing out in that 6 to 10 foot of water, throwing a crankbait in the fall, I'm probably going to be going with a crawdad kind of color. So, and I've mentioned a couple times, kind of sprinkled in there, wind this time of the year is a big, big thing for me. If I'm running up the lake and the wind's blowing out of the north, I'm going to focus most all my time on that south shoreline. I don't care if I've spent a lot of time over there, if it's a deal where I've practiced for a couple days and I was catching fish on the other side. If I'm fishing this time of the year, wherever that wind is blowing, wherever that wind is hitting, that's where I'm going to focus. The places that are out of the wind, that aren't catching it at all, I'm not going to say I won't fish any, but I have to really have a reason to. I'm going to spend my time in that wind, where that wind is pushing up on, and that's going to have the bait fish and the bass in there, definitely feeding in a way that I'm able to catch them with a crankbait a lot more efficiently. So wind is absolutely your friend in the fall, and November is a prime time for that. But there truly is a transition, and that's kind of what I'm wanting to emphasize on in this video, is that transition that you work through in November with your crankbait fishing, from that really shallow, more aggressive, wider wobbling baits out to that little bit deeper stuff, a little bit more subtle, more natural baits as that water cools off, and those fish tend to slide out there a little bit with it. So just keep that in mind. What worked, if you get to go fishing early November and then late in November, man, what worked early on, not to say that it can't work at all, but you're probably going to have to make a little bit of adjustments on it towards the end of the month to stay in tune with those fish. For all those baits, man, my crankbait setup that I've talked about so much, so many different times, and I've caught so many bass on, that Bass Pro cranking stick, 7 foot medium heavy action. a Bass Pro Platinum reel, 6/8 to 1 gear ratio, and 12-pound is my go-to in that XPS fluorocarbon line for most everything here except that Rocco. I'm probably going to have it on 14 the majority of the time. But if you were going to set up one, man, put 12-pound test on it and just go. Just be sure you check your line often enough if you're cranking in those rocks and a lot of heavy cover, and you won't have any trouble then. But yeah, that setup, man, I'd like to see all the fish in one pile that I've caught on a 7-foot Bass Pro cranking stick. But yeah, get out there this November and man, be sure you tie you on a few different crankbaits. Give them a try. Try some different depth ranges with them, and I think you'll have a good time on the water. We'll catch you on the next one.